please visit my website, programtokill.net. Go to plans and prices for even more exclusive information. You can also support me now on Patreon. Add me on TikTok. And leave a like and comment. So, I saw you wrote like 5-6 articles about war crimes and also about ex-soldiers.
That's right, yeah. I'm doing a PhD at the moment on war crimes committed by the British Army in Iraq. And so when I was researching it, a lot of cases came up involving abusive underage boys in Iraq. And from there, I just sort of started branching out and looking at various cases involving British soldiers, ex-soldiers who had been involved in child abuse cases and the similarities that kind of came up. And it was there I started, looking into the documentary The Boy Business, which you're familiar with, of course. And as I was sort of researching these cases, there were just so many different military connections that started coming up. So yeah, I began researching, looking into it from there. In the most recent article I wrote that I sent to you, it touched on sort of Warwick Spinks and the connection that he has with this network involving a lot of former British military personnel involved in child abuse. So yeah, I thought it would be worthwhile to discuss some of that, especially because you've looked a lot at Warwick Spinks and yeah, there's a very interesting connection there. So yeah, I thought it would definitely be worthwhile to sort of discuss that a bit more.
No, we can definitely do that. If you can give like a summary of your whole article and also about Sidney Cooke, about his gang.
Yeah. Definitely. So basically what my article lays out is that Sidney Cooke, he was the leader of this paedophile gang, which operated in the 1970s and 1980s. It had a particular focus on targeting young boys in the UK. Sidney Cooke, he told police when he was sent to prison that this gang was basically responsible for the murder of up to 15 boys in the UK in the 1970s and 80s. There have been allegations that it could be as high as 25, but it's a significant number of victims that they had. Sidney Cooke, he was basically a very sadistic and manipulative child abuser. He had a military connection because he served in the British Army between 1945 and 1952. He served in the Middle East. Sidney Cooke, he led this gang. It was dubbed in the British press the Dirty Dozen, and it was basically a group of men who had a particular interest in abusing boys, including killing boys, and they specialized in very sadistic, very violent abuse. In the 1980s, 1985, they were responsible for the murder of a 14-year-old boy called Jason Swift. He lived on the Kingsmead estate in Hackney in London, which is a very deprived council estate. What you find in a lot of these cases is that children who grow up on council estates in the UK, they're often very neglected. They live in very deprived and impoverished circumstances, which means that they're very vulnerable to malevolent individuals like Sidney Cooke, who want to prey on them. Jason Swift, he was a 14-year-old boy. He was he was tortured to death by Sidney Cooke's gang in 1985. That same year, a 6-year-old boy named Barry Lewis, he was murdered by the gang in similar circumstances to Jason Swift. Now, what one finds if you skip forward to 1994, there was a duo this time, two men. One of them, his name was Timothy Morss. The other one was Brett Tyler. Timothy Morss, he also had a military background. He previously served in the British Army for 18 months as a military driver. In 1994, this duo, they murdered a 9-year-old boy named Daniel Handley. He lived on another council estate, very deprived. Daniel's mother was a drug addict. His father wasn't in the picture, and it basically meant that Daniel and his brothers, they were left to fend for themselves on the streets. So Daniel, he did various odd jobs to try and get just some money to buy comic books, food, things that young boys, they would spend pocket change on. He used to wipe windscreens for drivers, just various odd jobs that a young boy might do. He was known locally as a very helpful boy, very cheeky, chirpy. He was well known in the area. He was abducted by Timothy Morss and Brett Tyler because they presented him with a map as they were driving. They asked for help with directions on this map. Daniel, being the very helpful boy that he was, he went towards the car to help them. They bundled him into the car. Long story short, they raped him and they murdered him. Now, it later turned out that there was a connection between Timothy Morss and Sidney Cooke, and that connection was that Timothy Morss and Brett Tyler, they were friends with another sex offender, and this sex offender had shared a prison cell with Sidney Cooke, and Sidney Cooke divulged to this man various techniques that the Dirty Dozen used to abduct boys, including pretending that you need help with directions on a map, using tranquilizer. These were techniques that they had used on Daniel. So it was as a result of this connection with Sidney Cooke that they got the inspiration for using the techniques that they used to abduct Daniel. The police at the time that Daniel went missing, there were suspicions around Timothy Morss and Brett Tyler. They had a history of committing violent sexual offences against young boys. Now, the police who was in charge of investigating this case, he suspected that there was a link between what had happened to Daniel and the activities of the Dirty Dozen. It was a very similar sort of crime. A young boy, he was abducted in broad daylight. He was the perpetrators. There were various witnesses who identified people who had strong resemblances with Timothy Morss and Brett Tyler. He suspected that there was some kind of connection, but when he tried to look into it, there were all kinds of roadblocks which were placed in his way, and in particular, he wasn't given access to the files from Operation Orchid, which was the police investigation into the Dirty Dozen. And he looked everywhere through these files. He was told by the intelligence branch of the police that the files had all been destroyed. He thought this was astounding because, as he put it, this was the major police inquiry into paedophile abuse in London, and the files had all gone. He was being told that they had been destroyed. no one else knew where he could locate them. And so he hit a dead end. And it was only by chance, because there was a typist in the police station he worked who told him she previously worked on Operation Orchid and she knew where he could locate some of the files, that he was able to locate some of them. And it was from looking into that, he was able to, he ended up on the trail of Timothy Morss and Brett Tyler. But that was only months later. And in the meantime, Timothy Morss and Brett Tyler continued to abuse children. Now, already that raises significant questions. Why was it that the higher-ups in the police force either apparently didn't know where these files were or were telling him that they had been destroyed? And it was only by chance he was able to locate these files, which put him on the trail of these abusers. You find other connections here. Already you have Sidney Cooke, military background, served in the British Army. Timothy Morss, who masterminded the abduction and murder of Daniel Handley, military background, served in the British Army. Another connection with Sidney Cooke appears with another military link. If you look at a man named Ronald Jebson, who in 1970 he abducted 2 young children, and he murdered them. He raped them and he murdered them in Epping Forest in Essex. Ronald Jebson, he was also a former British soldier. He was friends with Sidney Cooke and Leslie Bailey, who was another member of the Dirty Dozen. And Epping Forest, where he murdered these children, was very close to where Jason Swift's body was later found, murdered by the Dirty Dozen, and Barry Lewis's body was later found, murdered by the Dirty Dozen. So that's another military connection which appears there. Another military connection which comes up is William Malcolm. William Malcolm, he was a close friend of Sidney Cooke and Leslie Bailey again. He was well acquainted with the Dirty Dozen. He also previously served in the British Army. And in the 1980s, he was responsible for a series of very serious sexual offences against his stepdaughter in particular, as well as his stepson, and other children he victimised. In the 1980s, he would brag to his victims, his child victims, that he had been present at the murder of Jason Swift. And the military element that pops up in that case is that he would tell his victims he had served in the British Army, and he would beat them with his army belt as part of the abuse that he subjected them to. And what's particularly shocking in the case of William Malcolm is that the longest jail sentence which he served for these continuous abuses that he committed, and he was described in a psychiatrist's report as a sexual psychopath, highly sadistic paedophile. The longest sentence that he served for those offences was 2 years. Initially, he only got 1 year in prison. He was out of prison in a year. He continued to abuse children. He was then given a 2-year prison sentence. He was out after 2 years, continued to engage in criminal activity. His stepdaughter, by that time, his younger stepdaughter, she was placed in care. And he would continuously show up outside the care home where she was, and he would follow her to school, and he continued to make her life miserable. And he was allowed to walk the streets, engaging in this behaviour for years. And his younger stepdaughter, she later said, he destroyed her life. He was questioned by police in relation to the abductions of Jason Swift, Barry Lewis, Mark Tildesley. Mark Tildesley was a 7-year-old boy who was abducted, murdered by the Dirty Dozen in 1984. He was abducted from a fun fair in Wokingham in the UK. And there's another military connection which comes up again here, which is that Brian Turner, who was a member of the Dirty Dozen, he was the man who first introduced Jason Swift to Sidney Cooke in 1985, a few months before he was murdered. Brian Turner, he was a member of another paedophile ring called the Baden-Powell Scouting Association. This was a breakaway scouting organisation in the UK, and it was run by a paedophile ring of which Brian Turner was a member. They subjected boys to sadistic sexual abuse. They videotaped it, and some of the videotapes which they produced were sold in Amsterdam by Warwick Spinks, who's he was a former Hastings resident. He lived in Hastings in the southeast of England. He then moved to Amsterdam. Well, he was back and forth really between the UK and Amsterdam during this period. He was selling videos which were produced by Brian Turner, among others, an associate of Sidney Cooke, in Amsterdam. One of the associates of Warwick Spinks in Amsterdam in the late 1980s, early 1990s, was a man named John Gay. John Gay, his nickname was Army John. He was also a former soldier. John Gay, Warwick Spinks, there are a few other individuals. Alan Williams from Wales, just as John Gay was from Wales. Few other individuals. They were from the UK. They were based in Amsterdam. Now, there's a lot of evidence. I say a lot of evidence. There's at least substantial evidence that the paedophile ring, which was operated by these British individuals, including ex-soldier John Gay in Amsterdam in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they were involved in producing snuff films, which were films where children were murdered on camera. In particular, boys. They targeted boys. The evidence comes from the fact that multiple different witnesses told the UK police that they had watched these films, and they described different settings, different periods during this time period, late 1980s, early 1990s, different years that they viewed these tapes, different settings, but there were details in all of their accounts of what they witnessed which matched up with each other, which correlated with each other in very striking ways. And the thing that was consistent in what these witnesses told UK police was that in each case, one video, it was shot in a barn, another video was shot in a flat, other videos, they were shot in different locations, but the constant theme throughout what these witnesses told the UK police is that the central character of the film would be a boy, typically early to mid-teens, and in the video he would be beaten, he would be raped, he would be castrated, and then he would be cut open with a knife. And that was the consistent pattern of what these different witnesses, told the UK police. So the films followed this set theme, with slight variations. And another detail which is important and which gives credibility to what these witnesses were saying is that UK police, they discovered that in the early 1990s, John Gay and the others in that ring, British ring in Amsterdam, they had discussed making a video in a barn featuring a boy. Sometime later, another witness told UK police he had witnessed a film shot in a barn, which followed the pattern that I described earlier. And John Gay, he was the joint owner of a child pornography company, which operated in Amsterdam at the time, called Tag Films, which specifically featured boys being subjected to violent sexual abuse. And Warwick Spinks, I should say, he told an undercover police officer in Amsterdam that he knew people who were involved in making snuff films. He knew a boy who was murdered in a snuff film, and he gave a description. So Warwick Spinks admitted to an undercover police officer that this phenomenon was real, and he knew the people involved. Nothing ever became of that investigation. It fell apart. Dutch police were unwilling to act on certain information that was given to them. No bodies were ever found. I should say, though, that that's not unusual in the cases that we're looking at, because most of the boys who were murdered by the Dirty Dozen in the 1970s and 80s in the UK, their bodies were never found either. And members of the Dirty Dozen, they told the UK police various locations where bodies had been buried. We don't know if those were ever looked into, but in most cases, bodies simply never surfaced. Children went missing. As I said, they were from very poor backgrounds. Some of them were white, some of them were non-white. The common thread in all of those cases is that the children were very, very vulnerable. And when vulnerable children go missing, often there's simply a lack of concern. It's not prioritized. And so in the vast majority of cases, bodies were never discovered. All we know is that children went missing, children disappeared. Leslie Bailey, in particular, in the Dirty Dozen, he came forward. He gave police detailed descriptions of how murders took place. But that was it. The children were just simply never found. The last thing I'll say on this sort of network is that in Amsterdam in the 1990s, there was a videotape which was owned by, according to the Dutch press, was owned by virtually every paedophile in Amsterdam in the decade. And it was known as the Bjorn tape. And this tape, it was produced by another former British soldier whose name was John Peters. John Peters, he was in the British Army in the early 1970s. He went AWOL from his base in Sutton Coldfield in the UK. The reason being that he had sexually assaulted a 14-year-old boy in public toilets near his military base. He ended up in Amsterdam. In 1990, he and another man, they produced a video. Later came out in court that the initiative was John Peters's. They produced this video, which featured he was initially reported to have been an 8-year-old boy, a Dutch boy, being sexually assaulted very violently on camera for a protracted period of time. Now, what's significant about that case is that it was revealed in the Dutch press that in the raw files of the Bjorn tape, sort of the extended cut, if you will, John Peters, he lifts his sleeve up and he reveals to the camera that he has a tattoo on his arm. It says blood group O pos, meaning blood group O positive. This was a tattoo which British soldiers were known to get in the early 1970s in particular, and it was ostensibly meant to be there so that if a soldier was wounded on the battlefield, medics would know what blood group they were if they needed a blood transfusion. Another significant detail is that in the Bjorn tape, Bjorn, who's the young child who's victimized in the tape, he's initially brought in hooded. And hooding was a practice which was officially authorized in the British Army between 1965 and 1972, which was the rough period in which we know John Peters served in the army. And the British Army used hooding against young boys. And this is, we know this, it took place in Aden, which is now Yemen. It took place in Northern Ireland. So you have these recurring details from the military service of some of these men coming up again in the abuse that they carried out. Just to add one thing to that, one of the cases which the Dirty Dozen, Sidney Cooke's gang, is strongly suspected of carrying out is the abduction and murder of Vishal Mehrotra, who was a little boy who went missing in 1981. His body was later found the remains of his body were found about a year later. The Dirty Dozen, they bragged in prison that they had killed an Asian boy, and Sidney Cooke was later found to have been very close on the day that Vishal went missing to the place where his body was later discovered. The only sort of detail that emerged from witness accounts following the abduction of Vishal Mehrotra is that a man was seen in military uniform or military attire holding the hand of a small Asian boy very close to the place where Vishal's remains were later discovered. He was a tall man, he was wearing military style uniform, khakis, and the witnesses, it stood out to witnesses at the time because they said it was so unusual back then to see someone in that sort of military gear in England at the time walking around, and he was holding the hand of this Asian boy, and that stood out to people. And we know Sidney Cooke previously served in the army, so you have these various echoes, of their military service. It comes up again, it's a recurring theme, and you have these men who served in the British Army. They played an outsized role in this network. Again and again you see, if you look into their background, military service within the British Army, and that's something which sort of stands out if you look at this sort of broad network of individuals. And my research, it focuses on British Army war crimes, and if you look through the history, the sort of post-Second World War era, whether it's Northern Ireland, Aden, Cyprus in the 1950s, later Iraq, Afghanistan, you see this recurring pattern of young boys in particular being subjected to sadistic sexual abuse by British soldiers during their deployments. And that stretches back, as I discuss in the article, it stretches back really to even in the 1700s, 1800s, when young boys would be press ganged into the military in the UK. They would be subject to brutal punishments, often had a sexual element if they tried to desert, if they disobeyed orders. You have this sort of culture that persists in the military involving victimization of children, in particular boys. It's a strong sadistic sexual element to it. And so it's not really that surprising that a lot of these individuals who have this special interest in subjecting boys to violent sexual abuse, sadistic sexual abuse, that they have that military background. That doesn't mean that everyone in the military is like that, has that mindset. There are a lot of good people in the military, but there's this particular culture which persists within parts of the military, and it manifests in it manifests in war crimes that you see being committed by the British Army in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Aden, Cyprus, etc. And you see it as well in the fact that these ex-soldiers who are from that particular background, they then perpetrate crimes against children when they leave the military. So yeah, that's basically the breakdown of my article.
No, thanks so much, Irfan, for this whole summary of the written article. I want to ask you, are you also going to write a new article, maybe about what we discussed earlier about Levi Bellfield or Ian Handley, because they also have military connections?
Definitely, I think that would definitely be something worth writing about. And thank you for bringing those cases to my attention, because I wasn't previously that well informed about them. I'd heard about the cases, I'd read some things about them, but I wasn't greatly informed. But it was very interesting in the information that you sent me about Levi Bellfield in particular, the fact that at the nightclub that he was working at, Royales, this was a nightclub which was very popular among local RAF airmen. And the information that came out was that this nightclub where Bellfield, he was working as a bouncer, he would be constantly allowing underage girls, 15-year-old girls, 14-year-old girls into this nightclub. He would take them upstairs and sexually assault them in a room in the upstairs of the club. One of his friends, who was a bouncer, he was also later alleged to have been involved in Bellfield's sexual offences. So you have this nightclub where local RAF airmen are constantly attending. It's very popular among them. According to a book that was written on Bellfield, a biographical account, RAF airmen, whenever they would turn up to this club, there would be constantly fights breaking out, violence. So we know local RAF airmen were constantly going there. They were behaving badly there. And Bellfield, who was a bouncer there, he was constantly allowing underage girls into the club. That raises very significant questions about to what extent did the RAF airmen who were going there constantly, to what extent did they know about the sexually abusive behaviour that was being committed in the club by Bellfield? I mean, it's very hard to believe that if these RAF airmen were constantly going to this club, engaging in bad behaviour there themselves, that they were unaware that the club was filled with underage girls who were being allowed in by Bellfield as a matter of routine. You know, did none of them see that Bellfield was leading underage girls upstairs to this room in the upstairs of the club? And to what extent did the officers at the local RAF airbase, you know, were they unaware that their subordinates at least were going to this club where they were constantly starting fights? Were they unaware of the nature of the club that was so popular among their subordinates? So again, there's a very troubling military connection there. And the other case you sent me, which was also very interesting, the so-called Sohan murders in 2002, where two young children were murdered. Their bodies were found outside of RAF Laken Heath, which was an RAF airbase. I know you have your own view on, you know, who was probably responsible for that. There are some views that, you know, were US military personnel in the airbase, were they potentially involved? To clarify, it's an RAF air station, but it's actually exclusively populated by US service personnel. So that's an interesting illustration of the extent to which the UK is subordinated to, you know, the United States militarily, politically. But the interesting feature from that case, which was in the information that you sent me on this, which was very interesting, was that the bodies of these children, they were found on the perimeter of that RAF airbase, and it's very difficult to access that part of the perimeter without going through the airbase. And despite that, UK police, they weren't given authorization to interview any of the US service personnel in RAF Lakenheath, which is a pretty astounding fact, given that, regardless of whether they were involved, had any involvement or whatever, just from the perspective of them being potential witnesses to what had happened, to the bodies being dumped there, they were the prime witnesses because they were in the airbase at the time. The bodies were dumped on the perimeter of the airbase. The fact that the UK police weren't given authorization to interview any of these people is really astounding, and it could potentially point to some kind of cover-up. It could also just be, again, an illustration of the fact that the UK is so willingly under the thumb of the United States, that at the time Tony Blair didn't want to upset the Bush administration by potentially implicating US service personnel in something very ugly, or subjecting them even to some kind of police investigation or inquiry. And so the UK just the government just didn't give the police authorization to interview any of these US service personnel. So that's a very interesting fact. Again, it points to this military connection. And it's very interesting when you look at these cases. Often there is some kind of military connection that comes up. Like for example, when I first saw the documentary The Boy Business, which was produced by ITV in the 1990s, and it covers Warwick, Spinks, and the Amsterdam ring, various other cases, I wasn't watching it expecting there to be a military connection. But then when I started reading more on the cases, I discovered there was this military connection, and then there was another military connection, and then there was another aspect of the network, and you look, there's another military connection. And so it's very interesting how when you look into these cases, often there is a military connection that comes up, and it's very interesting because it sort of shatters the idea that a lot of people in the UK they have of the military as this kind of sacrosanct institution, benevolent, heroic, etc., etc. And again, I'm not saying we should tar everyone in the military with one brush, and there are a lot of courageous, noble people in the military for sure. But as an institution, the fact that in all these child abuse cases, child murder cases, you find that there's military connections. You find, if you look at the conduct of the British Army overseas, or even domestically in Northern Ireland, for example, you find that there's child abuse going on, there's murder going on, there's torture. It all comes together to kind of present a very different image of how soldiers often behave, how the military often behaves as an institution, a very different image from what most people would like to believe. And I'm sure you've sort of come to similar understandings and realizations through your own remarkable research, that government institutions, state institutions, which so many people, in the West, we tend to have an instinctive view growing up that these institutions are benevolent, they're looking out for us, they try to do the right thing. Actually, there's a huge undercurrent of darkness in these institutions. And again, I want to really commend you for the work that you're doing, because you're doing such an important job of exposing that darkness, shedding light on it, and it's something which everyone needs to be aware of. But so many people aren't aware of it, and I think a lot of times people would rather not be aware of it, because it's comforting to think that, you know, the state, the institutions of your society genuinely are benevolent. They care about human rights. You know, they're looking out for vulnerable people, and actually so often the opposite is the case. So again, I want to really thank you for the work that you're doing, because it's so important in shining a light on all of this.
No, also thank you, Irfan, for this conversation and your written articles. You have an open invitation to come back to the podcast if you want. And at the top of my mind, I can also recall one UK serial killer case, Dennis Nielsen. He had a big military record. Maybe we can also delve into that one time.
100%, yeah. I did write another article for Bella Caledonia, which does actually discuss the case of Nelson. So it would definitely be interesting to come back on and discuss that at some point, definitely.
Yeah, I will check out your website, and I will leave in the video description box a link for your articles.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds really good. And thank you again for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. It's been really good getting to share this information, put it in the hands of more people. So thank you again.
Thank you, likewise. Have a nice weekend already, yeah?
Yeah, you too.
Bye.